There is a silence in old monasteries that no stone ever forgets. Even after centuries, when ivy overtakes the walls and moss softens the corners of crumbling cloisters, the quiet remains. It isn't just the absence of sound. It is a texture, like the thin wool of a monk's robe or the brittle air of a cold dawn. It lingers, pressed deep into the cracks of hand-carved pews and worn slate floors, a memory older than memory itself. In one such monastery, hidden between the folds of the northern hills, where the snow fell early and lingered long, there once lived a group of monks who spoke very little and slept with geese. This, of course, is not how the story begins in most books. You won't find the geese mentioned in Latin scrolls or the illuminated manuscripts in grand libraries. They rarely made it into the margins of history, where battles and kings took up too much space. But they were there, honking softly at the edges of human life, waddling their way into the warmth of monastic routine, curling, one after another, at the feet of men who had chosen silence over speech. The story begins in the cold. The monastery was simple, even by medieval standards. A square of weather-darkened stone surrounded a tiny courtyard where herbs grew under straw domes in winter. Each brother had a task, and each task was performed with quiet ritual. Some tilled frozen earth with bare hands, while others copied faded script under beeswax candles that trembled in the breath of unseen drafts. Their robes were thick, but not thick enough. The wind from the hills bit through wool as if it were paper. Brother Anselm was the youngest of them all. Not by much, perhaps 4 winters, but in such places youth made you noticeable. His hands were pink from the cold, and he always walked slightly faster than the others, as if he had not yet unlearned haste. He kept the candles lit. That was his task. Each morning, before the first bell rang, he passed through the stone halls with a bundle of wicks and a horn of oil, stopping at every niche, every altar, and every draughty stairwell to coax light into being. It was on one such morning, just after the feast of St. Cecilia, that he noticed the first goose. It had wandered in through the cloister gate, its feet red with cold and its feathers clumped with sleet. Anselm paused. The bird blinked up at him, made no sound, and waddled into the warmth of the chapel vestibule as if it had always belonged there. He followed it, quietly, curious. It settled beneath the low-burning lantern near the sacristy, tucking its beak under one wing with the resigned dignity of all creatures who have known winter too well. Anselm watched it for a long time, his candle slowly melting in his grip. He did not tell anyone. It began with 1, but soon there were 3. Then 5. They came when the air turned sharp and the trees cracked in their sleep. Geese, from the nearby pond or perhaps from somewhere farther, no one truly knew, began to appear near the monastery. At first the monks tolerated them. Then they noticed something peculiar. The geese stayed where there was warmth. They nestled, near the ovens in the baking room. They huddled close to the bodies of monks who sat quietly in the chapel after evening prayer, and on the coldest nights they curled themselves beneath the wooden bunks in the sleeping quarters, pressing their downy bodies against calloused feet and thin blankets. There were murmurs among the brothers, but no one objected, for when a goose lay beside you, the cold did not bite quite so deep. It is easy to think of monks as men above earthly things, but the truth is gentler. They lived among simplicity, not above it, and in that simplicity they understood the gifts of the world, better than most. A warm fire, a loaf of bread, the flicker of light on stone, all were precious. A living creature that offered warmth on a freezing night was not a disturbance. It was grace in feathers. Brother Matthias, the prior, began to speak of the geese as companions, not intruders. They bring no noise, he said over lentil broth one evening, and they steal nothing we cannot spare. Brother Edmund, who had spent 3 winters without full use of his toes, quietly began letting 2 geese sleep beneath his bed. Anselm, who still lit the candles before dawn, now carried crumbs in his sleeves. The birds followed him, waddling in solemn procession, as if they too had taken holy vows. No rule was changed, no law written. But the monastery, over that long winter, became a home for more than just men. There are records of frost so fierce it broke clay jars and froze ink in the inkwells. That winter, they say, snow drifted against the windows so high that some monks had to tunnel their way to the chapel with wooden planks and prayer. But inside, beside the warmth of feathered bodies and the rhythm of ancient chants, there was a stillness that no blizzard could breach. Brother Anselm would sometimes lie awake and listen, not to the wind outside, but to the soft, wet breath of the goose at his feet. It was not like human breath. It was slower, more rhythmic, like the sea, or sleep itself. He began to wonder if the geese dreamed, and if they did, what they dreamed about. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of hauling frozen wood, Anselm slipped while carrying a basket of kindling and twisted his ankle on the icy steps outside the kitchen. The pain was sharp, and he gasped, a rare sound in those stone halls. Brother Thomas found him and helped him to his bunk. The injury was not serious, but enough to keep him from his duties for several days. Anselm hated idleness. It made the cold feel heavier. It made the silence feel less sacred. But that night, as he lay with his leg propped on straw, the goose, his goose as he now thought of it, climbed awkwardly onto the edge of his blanket and settled there. It made no noise, just rested its head beside his leg and stared at him with a deep black eye that did not blink. He fell asleep quickly, and for the first time in days, the pain did not wake him. The rhythm of the monastery was never loud, but it had a kind of music to it. Oh, soft cadence of bells, footsteps, turning pages, and whispered prayers. The geese became part of that music. Their steps, their soft honks, even their preening, the rustle of feathers like parchment, fit into the quiet hum of monastic life. Visitors, when they came, were sometimes surprised. "You keep geese indoors?" one asked, a nobleman from the south. Brother Matthias only smiled. "They keep us warm," he said. The nobleman laughed. But he did not understand. Not truly, for warmth is not just a matter of heat. It is a presence, a companionship that is both silent and whole. Anselm began keeping notes, tiny scraps of parchment hidden in the folds of his psalter. Observations about the birds, how they curled their necks, how they responded to music, how their bodies seemed to pulse in time with the breathing of the monks. He was not a scholar, not truly, but in those notes a kind of quiet affection bloomed. One day he found an egg near the oven. It was small, pale, warm. He held it in both hands, unsure what to do. Eventually, he tucked it into a nest of straw beside the hearth. Days passed. The goose that usually followed him began staying near it. Anselm checked on it every morning. When it hatched, he was there. He did not cry out, but he smiled. And that smile in the hush of stone and prayer was louder than a hymn. No one spoke of the geese as pets. That would have been too simple. They were not named. They were not caged. They came and went as they pleased. Some returned every winter. Some stayed year-round. Some disappeared. But they were remembered. And in the stillness of each morning, as Anselm lit the candles and the geese followed behind him like quiet sentinels, the monks began to feel that the birds had always been there, that they had been waiting, that the cold had called them, and the monastery, with its silence and its stone and its gentle breath-warmed chambers, had finally answered. The sun rarely touched the monastery in winter. When it did rise, it did so with reluctance, spilling light across the hills like warm milk slowly tipped from a jug. The cloister arches caught the pale gold briefly, enough to gild the snowdrifts, resting on their ledges before retreating once more into shadow. Days passed not in hours, but in rituals. The soft clang of the bell, the whisper of rope against skin as hoods were raised, the scuff of woolen soles on stone, and between these moments of sound there was stillness. In that stillness the geese thrived. They were not meant to, of course. Nature had not written them into the script of cloistered life. Yet here they were, dignified, observant, and utterly at peace in the rhythm of prayer and silence. Anselm, though no longer the youngest, brother. Peter had arrived late in the autumn, remained the one most bound to the birds, not out of duty, but something gentler. When he moved through the cloister at dawn, his steps slow and even, the birds often followed. Not all of them, but a few, always the same few. One limped from a childhood injury, another bore white streaks in its feathers as if it had aged ahead of its time. These small imperfections seemed to draw Anselm to them even more. The brothers no longer questioned it. If anything, they leaned into it. Brother Matthias, gray of beard and slow in step, had always believed that true prayer required the body to participate. Kneel with humility, he would say. Stand with intention. Sit with peace. The presence of the geese, he believed, offered an unexpected lesson in this, for they too moved with intention. They watched, they followed, they settled. You see them breathing, he said one morning as Anselm helped him stack firewood in the kitchen. Look closely. They breathe with the earth, not against it. Anselm looked. He always looked. It was true. The geese never startled, not in the way birds normally do. They did not flap wildly when someone entered the chapel or when the bell rang. They blinked slowly. They moved carefully. They never panicked. As if they understood that panic had no place in a world shaped by sacred rhythm. As January deepened, the cold became a thing with weight. The monks felt it in their joints, in their teeth. The wind scraped the corners of the windows, leaving thin threads of frost like lace against the glass. The oil lamps burned lower than usual, and the woodpile began to shrink more quickly than Brother Edmund liked. "We will ration the fires," Matthias announced one evening, his voice kind but resolute. "One per wing, one in the scriptorium. The Lord provides." The geese, however, required no fire. Their bodies, pressed in groups against the worn stone, radiated their own heat. That warmth, shared between them and with the brothers, became the monastery's quiet miracle. It became common now for 3 or 4 monks to rise in the night and add hay or fabric to corners where the geese slept. They no longer waited for permission. It was no longer strange. Anselm noticed Brother Peter one morning, hunched in the shadow of the south hallway, gently stroking the feathers of the limping goose. He did not interrupt. There were some things that only silence could. Witness. The cloister garden, little more than a patch of dormant herbs and snowdrifts this time of year, had become the geese's sanctuary. When the sun appeared, they basked there, necks stretched, eyes closed, unmoving. When the snow returned, they nestled beneath the rosemary or sage bushes, unbothered by the cold. One morning, as Anselm passed through the cloister on his way to clean the baptismal font, he noticed something odd. 2 geese sat facing one another beneath the ivy-covered wall, a long feather caught between them. At first he thought it was play, but the way they moved, the deliberate back-and-forth motion of their heads, the almost synchronized dipping of their necks, suggested something else, a ritual, a rhythm. He paused, watched, waited. Later, as he scraped wax from the floor beside the altar, he thought about it again. Could animals have liturgies of their own? Was there perhaps a kind of worship in the way the geese tended one another, shielded the young, shared warmth without needing to speak? He did not write these thoughts down, but they stayed with him. During the long evenings when the sun dipped, Below the hills before the third bell, the monks gathered for silent reading. The room was dim, lit by 2 lanterns and the soft glow of snow reflected against the windows. The geese came too, some curling near the doorway, others slipping quietly under benches or along the walls. On one such evening, Brother Elias read aloud from the Rule of St. Benedict. Though reading aloud was rare, this section was favored in winter. Let all guests who arrive be received as Christ, for he is going to say, I came as a guest, and you received me. There was a pause, a moment of breath, and then a honk. Soft, not disruptive, just present. The room did not laugh, but there was a shift, a shared warmth, a knowing glance exchanged between Matthias and Elias, and even Brother Edmund, who was often stern in his devotions, allowed the corners of his mouth to soften. Was it foolish, Anselm wondered, to imagine that these birds had been sent as guests? Was it foolish to imagine that they stayed because they were received? Anselm found himself dreaming more often now, not strange, symbolic dreams, not visions, but slow, quiet ones. He dreamed of snow, of walking barefoot across a frozen meadow, the grass stiff like needles beneath his toes, and then, always, a goose, at first far away, then close, then beside him, its warmth pressing against his leg, its breath soft and even. Sometimes in the dream, the goose would speak, not with words, with presence, with weight, with nearness. He never woke startled, only hushed. Midway through February, the youngest of the geese, the hatchling that had appeared in the kitchen weeks before, began to wander. At first it stayed near the oven, where its shell had cracked and crumbled open. But slowly it began venturing farther, through the hallway, past the foot of Anselm's bed, into the chapel vestibule, and once even into the scriptorium, where Brother Elias nearly spilled ink trying to avoid stepping on it. The brothers began, calling it Little Cloister, though never aloud. Anselm took to leaving crumbs by the door each morning, not enough to spoil the bird, but enough to encourage its visits. One morning, while kneeling at prayer, he felt a light weight press against his calf. The hatchling had tucked itself against him, mimicking the behavior of the older birds. He did not move. Not until the bell rang, and even then, only with great care. There are no maps for the inner life, no ink lines to guide the heart through loneliness or cold, or the simple ache of waking before dawn in a room that never truly warms. But there are signs, there are echoes, and sometimes there are feathers. Anselm began finding them in places that made him pause, one beside his psalter, another inside his cloak, though he did not know how it had gotten there, once folded beneath his blanket, perfectly, clean and white, as if placed there with intention. He never told anyone, not even Matthias. But each time he kept them, tucked in the crease of a book or behind the wooden cross above his bed. Feathers for Anselm became markers of quiet grace. March arrived not with thaw but with wind, sharp, cutting gusts that swept through the trees like invisible blades. The geese, however, remained. They had every reason to leave. The pond was still frozen, the wind carried no scent of food, and yet they stayed, huddled beneath cloister arches, sharing space with men who had given their lives to silence and simplicity. Some began nesting, not many, just 2 or 3. Little Cloister, too young for such things, now followed Anselm nearly constantly, stopping only to nap near the fires or preen beside puddles of melted snow. Brother Peter remarked one evening that he had not dreamt of his old life in over a month. "I used to see my father's face," he said quietly, without lifting his eyes, "and now I see wings." No one answered. They did not need to. One morning, Anselm rose late, only by a few minutes. But in the monastery, minutes mattered. The candles were already lit when he arrived in the chapel. He froze, looked around. There were no brothers in sight, only a faint warmth in the air and, there, near the altar, a goose. His goose. The older, one with the white streaks. It stood still, watching the flame flicker. He approached. Slowly. The goose did not move, did not startle. Just looked at him. He reached out. Its feathers were warm, as if it had been the one to light the candles. He smiled, just a little. Then began his prayers. Later that day, as Brother Matthias passed him in the corridor, he paused. "You were not first to the chapel this morning," Matthias said, eyes twinkling. "No, Father," Anselm replied softly. Matthias waited. Then, "But it seems someone was." Anselm nodded. "Then the flame was kept," Matthias said, continuing on his way. That evening, as snow began to fall once more and the monastery folded itself into another night of stillness, Anselm knelt by his bed. He did not speak. But one by one the geese came, and together, in the hush of stone and time and memory, they breathed, and the silence, oh, the silence was full. Winter was not a season. It was a presence. The kind that settled deep into the joints of the stone monastery and stayed long after its final snows. Even as the days began to lengthen and the barest suggestion of thaw reached the edges of the distant woods, the cold inside the monastery still hummed low and steady like the bottom note of a hymn that never ceased. But there were other presences too. Feathers in hallways, wet prints on flagstones, the soft rise and fall of a body asleep, beside another, and eyes, watchful, blinking, calm. The geese had stayed. Even as the wild birds wheeled northward across the gray sky and the lower villages began to hear the drip of melting eaves, the monastery's geese remained. Not for lack of freedom, for the gates were never closed to them. They remained because something in the monastery's rhythm had folded them in. They were no longer visitors. They were part of the breath of the place. Anselm rose earlier now, not out of obligation, but by instinct. There was something about those hours before the first bell, the world still hushed in pre-dawn, the cloisters like painted shadows, that made his steps softer and his mind quieter. Sometimes he would simply sit by the scriptorium window and listen to the silence, broken only by the whisper of a wing or the sigh of wind through mortar. One morning, as he passed through the north hallway with a taper to relight the lanterns, he noticed something unusual. A goose standing not in the warmth, but directly in the center of a freezing draught, near the cracked wall beside the dormitory. It did not shiver. It simply stood, facing the outer wall, motionless. He paused. The bird remained still. He left, relit the lamp, and returned. Still there. As he approached, the goose turned its head slowly, looked at him, then back at the stone. And suddenly, Anselm understood. It was guarding something. When Brother Elias examined the wall later that day, he discovered what the goose already knew. A deep fracture ran through the outer stone, invisible from a distance but wide enough to permit air, and moisture. It was the kind of structural threat that, left unnoticed, could grow into something grave. Repairs would be needed before the next freeze. "It's as if the goose knew," Elias said, shaking his head as he wrapped his scarf more tightly. "They're just animals, but sometimes I wonder." Brother Edmund, who rarely speculated on anything beyond Scripture, muttered as he passed, "Even Balaam's donkey had something to say." The monks did not laugh. The goose was fed extra that evening. No one said why. Brother Matthias began recording the geese in his margins. Not formally, he would not waste ink on unapproved chronicles, but in tiny notations alongside passages of Saint Benedict or Isaiah. A dot, a sketch of a feather. A simple G near the text that read, "In the company of the quiet, wisdom grows." He had lived through many winters. He had known silence in many forms, the silence of mourning, of doubt, of sacred awe. But the silence shared with another breathing thing, a creature that did not need words to be near, was a new kind of holiness. The geese did not disturb the silence. They honored it. Their presence was not noise. It was testimony. In the evenings, as the brothers warmed their hands over the chapel braziers, Anselm sometimes recited lines from the Psalms, softly, not as performance, but as rhythm. The geese gathered close, heads tilted, eyes half closed. Whether they understood was irrelevant. What mattered was the atmosphere created, something between hush and harmony. Psalm 104 became a favorite. The high hills are a refuge for the wild goats, and the stony cliffs for the conies. He paused each time before continuing. The fowls of the air shall make their nests by the waters and sing among the branches. The geese did not sing, but sometimes, just after the last word, a low honk would rise, and it felt appropriate. Not applause, not echo, just a note in the same key. One night, Brother Peter said quietly, "I used to think holiness had to be earned. Now I wonder if it's just accepted." The youngest goose, little Cloister, grew fast. Too fast, some joked. Its legs became strong, and its wings broader than the monks expected. But it did not fly. It stretched, yes, flapped when startled, but never left. One afternoon, as Anselm sat with a dry quill and a blank page before him, he watched the goose circling the edge of the cloister courtyard, dipping its head rhythmically into a puddle. Not drinking, just dipping, pausing, dipping again. A kind of pattern. It reminded him of the monks' walking prayer, slow steps in a circle, each turn marked by a breath or whispered line. He wondered, had the goose learned it by watching? Had they learned it from the goose? The kitchen was no longer only a place of fire and food. It had become a sanctuary of shared warmth. The stone oven gave off a steady heat, and the floor was always dry from the constant patting of feathers and feet. The monks sometimes lingered there longer than needed, speaking little, watching the birds preen or huddle together. Brother Elias had begun adding scraps from the bread loaves, leaving them near the hearth. "They earn it," he said when asked. He was not reprimanded. That week, a visitor from the southern cloisters arrived. Brother Lambert was not unkind, but precise. He walked with the stiffness of one trained in theological rigor, and his tone held the crispness of parchment uncreased. He arrived during a reading hour, and upon entering the chapel, paused at the sight of 3 geese curled along the wall. "I was told this was a place of order," he said, eyes narrowing. Matthias, seated near the altar, simply replied, "It is." Later, Lambert shared a meal with the brothers and watched in silence as a goose settled beneath Anselm's bench. He said nothing, but his fingers rested quietly on the edge of his cup, as if contemplating warmth from more than one source. The next morning, he left without further comment. But when Anselm collected the sleeping mats from the guest quarters, he found a single white feather folded into the linens. Spring was not a thunderclap. It came on tiptoe. The snow melted slowly, beginning at the highest points of the roof, dripping into the stone gutters in irregular rhythms. The pond cracked open like a yawn, then rippled into wakefulness. Buds emerged on the elder branches. And still the geese remained. This surprised some. Surely, with the thaw, they would return to the wild, take to the sky, rejoin their flocks. But instead they adapted. They moved differently now, less huddled, more exploratory. The cloister garden once again rustled with their steps. now joined by birdsong and bees. The geese did not seem disturbed by this competition. They simply coexisted. Anselm took to writing outside, when the sun allowed. Little Cloister often lay at his feet, stretching its neck across his sandals, asleep. He wrote slowly. Not theology, not sermons, just observation. The goose does not hurry. Its presence blesses the space it occupies. And another, perhaps the heart that makes. Room for silence also makes room for all quiet things. One evening, near the hour of compline, the bell rope snapped. It was a small thing, friction and age, but the sound startled the birds gathered in the bell tower courtyard. Most scattered, but one goose, a broad-feathered male with a distinctly brown patch above its eye, did not move. Instead, it stepped toward the rope, now tangled at the base of the wall, and pecked at it methodically. Brother Edmund, who had come to inspect the damage, watched silently. "I'll repair it by tomorrow," he said aloud, though no one else was there. The goose blinked at him. He knelt slowly, one hand steadying himself, and touched the frayed rope. The goose remained still. That night, Edmund retired, earlier than usual, and when asked days later whether the bell would ring again soon, he simply replied, "It never stopped." The older geese began to pair off. It was the natural way of things, but the monks, unused to such rhythms, watched with a kind of reverence. They knew these birds. They had seen them limp, preen, guard, rest. To see them choose one another felt deeply human. Little Cloister, however, remained alone. Perhaps it was too young. Perhaps it had already chosen Anselm. On a morning when fog curled thick across the grass and the sky looked bruised with coming rain, Anselm stood beneath the cloister arch, listening. No bell had rung, no footsteps stirred, but something inside him whispered, "Be still." The goose joined him a moment later, and they waited, together, in the hush that only comes before something is born. Not a storm, a season. That afternoon, Matthias called Anselm to the scriptorium. The room was quiet, though a fresh breeze stirred the parchment on the desk. "I want you to begin keeping a record," Matthias said. "Not of our rule, not of our tasks, but of this." He gestured out the narrow window toward the courtyard where a line of geese walked single file beneath the rosemary bushes. "A chronicle?" Anselm asked. "No," said Matthias, smiling gently. "A memory, a witness, for whoever comes next." Anselm nodded, and so that evening, by candlelight, he began to write. Not with haste, not with grandeur, just with care. He wrote of feathers, of warmth, of silence shared, of how holiness sometimes arrived without pronouncement, on webbed feet and with unblinking eyes, and in the margin a single white line shaped like the curve of a wing. By the time the orchard behind the monastery had begun to show hints of green, the geese were no longer a curiosity. They were part of the life of the monastery, as natural as the bread, as routine as the bell. Visitors still paused. Pilgrims sometimes stared. But for those who lived within the rhythm of the cloistered day, the geese had simply become. They watched, guarded, slept, and occasionally, when the light slanted a certain way through the cloister arches, danced. That is the only word for it. They spread their wings and lifted their heads, turning slowly in loose, spiraling arcs. Not frantic, not even playful, but with the same kind of solemnity with which monks move through procession. Perhaps it was a greeting to the sun. Perhaps it was instinct. Or perhaps, and this is what Anselm believed, it was an unspoken reply to being seen, to being allowed. Not all things in the world need naming. Some things simply need space. Brother Elias had once worked in a city scriptorium before joining the monastery. He had known great libraries and gilded manuscripts, had spent years hunched under domed ceilings with ink-stained hands and aching joints. But he had never, not once, written about animals. Now, in his private notes, neatly kept between pages of Latin, he scribbled small sketches of geese, one standing, one sleeping, one with wings raised like a chalice. He never spoke of these, but sometimes during meals he would glance toward the hearth where 3 geese always slept, and the corner of his mouth would lift in the smallest curve. Of understanding. "We think the Lord speaks only through thunder," he once whispered to Anselm, "but I've heard him in the rustle of feathers." Anselm didn't answer, but he understood, because some mornings before the bell, before the first prayer, before even his own footsteps had begun to echo down the stone corridor, he would feel the eyes. Not oppressive, not startling, just watchful, like the gaze of someone who has loved you in silence for a very long time. There was one goose that never followed the others. It was smaller than the rest, with mottled feathers and a dark mark along its beak. It didn't pair off. It didn't nest. It often stood alone in the herb garden or by the refectory door, as if content to observe the world rather than enter it. Anselm named it, though only in his mind. Sentinel. It seemed appropriate. It didn't guard the monastery. It didn't ward off foxes or intruders, but it watched with such stillness that its presence felt deliberate, even sacred. One evening, as Anselm passed through the cloister walk after copying a particularly tangled passage of Augustine, he saw Sentinel standing on the low wall beside the garden. The goose turned to face him, and Anselm, almost without thinking, bowed his head. Not as a joke, not in mockery, in reverence. Because something about that posture, that quiet attentiveness, stirred in him the same feeling he had once known as a child, kneeling before the tabernacle while a sunbeam struck the chalice just so. He did not understand it, but he did not dismiss it either. The monastery's daily rhythm did not change. Bells rang, bread baked, psalms whispered, but the monks' internal rhythms had. There was more laughter now, even if it was quiet, more shared glances, a little more waiting for one another, and always in the corners of rooms and the edges of gatherings there were feathers, not intrusive, just reminders. That softness had taken root, that stillness could be full, that warmth might wear wings. One morning, without any warning, little Cloister was gone. Anselm searched quietly, not with panic, but with that hollow ache that settles behind the ribs when something beloved has slipped from reach. He checked the pond, the cloister, the kitchen, even the roof walk, though the young goose had never flown that far. No sign. He did not speak of it that day, nor the next. But on the third morning, after waking before dawn and walking to the chapel alone, he found a single white feather on the stone step, and beside it, a print, webbed, small, melted slightly from the morning dew. Anselm sat. He held the feather but did not cry. Instead, he closed his eyes, and for the first time in weeks he prayed not in words, but in feeling, in gratitude. Because some companions do not stay. They arrive. They walk beside us. They share breath and warmth and stillness. And then, when the path calls them forward, they go. Not in absence, but in fulfillment. Brother Matthias, though slow of step and dim of eye, knew more than most assumed. He saw Anselm's shoulders carry something unspoken. He watched the way his hand lingered too long on the edge of the candle tray, the way he stood by the herb beds with his head tilted, listening for footsteps that never came. He said nothing, but on the 5th day, after evening meal, he asked Anselm to walk with him. They moved slowly, past the refectory, along the western corridor, where the light was warmest in spring. "You've grown," Matthias said simply. Anselm did not reply. Matthias continued. Not tall, not wide, but inward. They stopped near the chapel door. A goose was asleep nearby, its head tucked, under one wing, perfectly still. Loss is the final form of love, Matthias said, the part that teaches us its shape. Anselm lowered his gaze. But love that lives in silence, Matthias added, never truly vanishes. They stood for a long time, and the chapel bell rang with a gentleness neither had noticed before. The records Anselm had begun, his memory scrolls, grew longer. He no longer wrote only of behavior or signs. Now he wrote reflections, quiet thoughts, descriptions of moments no one else had seen. Brother Peter and the goose beside him, both asleep during prayer, both breathing in rhythm. Feather left on psalter, unclear if accident, feels deliberate. When we say brother, do we mean only men? He did not ask these questions aloud, but he did not hide them. Brother Elias once caught a glimpse and smiled. Perhaps the birds are writing their own scripture, he said. Without ink? Anselm asked. With presence, Elias replied, and somehow that felt truer than parchment. That year, the monastery did not suffer late frost. The apple trees bloomed early. The herbs returned strong. Even the cracked wall was repaired without incident. But change came in subtler forms. The monks, once rigid in their walking lines, now stepped aside for waddling feet. They opened doors more slowly. They paused longer at the sound of a wing beat or the echo of a soft honk in the evening dark. Anselm noticed that the geese had begun sleeping in new places. Under benches in the library. On warm patches of stone in the courtyard. Even once beside the brazier in Matthias' room. They were not hiding. They were settling. As if the monastery were no longer merely a place of passage, but of belonging. And then came the letter. It arrived in the early days of summer, carried by a barefoot traveler who had heard of the monastery with the birds. It came from a neighboring abbey, whose fields had suffered a strange sickness that spring, grain blackened, soil spoiled. The brothers there were cold, ill-fed, and seeking wisdom or assistance. Matthias read the letter aloud during the midday meal, then he folded it and passed it to Anselm. "You will go," he said. There was no debate. No hesitation. Because everyone knew Anselm had learned something, not doctrine, not law, but care. He packed lightly, a robe, a psalter, a sheaf of his notes, and as he stepped out of the cloister gate, 3 geese followed him. 2 turned back, 1 did not. Sentinel, they walked together. No cart, no company, just 1 monk and 1 goose. It took 2 days to reach the other abbey. When they arrived, the brothers there were too tired to react with surprise. But later, after supper, one novice asked, "Why the goose?" Anselm smiled gently. 2. Remember to breathe slowly, he said. That night he stayed in the guest chamber. Sentinel slept beneath the cot. At dawn, when Anselm rose to light the candles in a chapel not his own, the goose stood beside him, waiting, watching. Warm. The sky was different in the new abbey. It opened wider, as if the land had been carved more gently, the hills pushed farther from the eye. The wind arrived earlier in the day, and the soil was coarser, flecked with tiny stones that glittered at dawn. But even here, among strangers, worn crops, and empty pantries, there was the same quiet hunger. Not for bread or meat or drink, but for something softer, something that held warmth without burning, silence without emptiness. Anselm did not arrive with solutions. He did not arrive with sermons, only with his psalter, his careful eyes, and the goose. Sentinel. No one called the bird by name, but they knew it nonetheless. The way it followed, the way it lingered near the ill, the way it stood near the broken, parts of the wall where damp crept in, where repairs had failed and stone had begun to surrender. There was an understanding, unspoken, that where the goose stood, attention should follow. In the early weeks, Anselm worked beside the brothers in the fields. They were thin. Not weak, monks rarely are, but drawn in the way that comes from many seasons of failing grain and too few nights of restful sleep. Their garden had withered, their stores grown meager, and their spirits faded into tired rituals. He did not instruct. He observed. He turned soil where it would hold moisture longer. He rebuilt the beds to catch the shade of the chapel wall during the noon hour. And always the goose was near. Sometimes walking just ahead of him, sometimes curling in the space between his knees during rest, sometimes pecking lightly at weeds he hadn't yet pulled. "You treat it like a brother," one monk remarked. Anselm paused. "It treats me that way first." And that was all he said. On the 10th day, a rain came. Not much, but enough to dampen the earth and fill the air with the scent of growth. Anselm stood with the others, watching the droplets pool in the cracks of the cloister stone, and then, softly, carefully, the goose stepped into the middle of the courtyard, spread its wings, and began to turn. A spiral. 1, 2, 3 slow revolutions. The monks watched, unmoving, then one of them laughed, not mocking, but in wonder, and another smiled, and another knelt, arms open wide to the drizzle. No one spoke. But when the goose finally stopped and tucked its wings back against its sides, the silence that followed felt less like absence and more like a blessing. At night, Anselm began to write again. He used scraps of parchment, old sermon backs, the faded margins of worn hymnals, not to record doctrine, but memories, small notations of life. Brother Thomas sang today while mending a tunic, not well, but joyfully. The goose led me to the root cellar, discovered a cracked beam near the entrance, could have collapsed. 2 feathers beside my pillow, one white, one gray. He made no effort to create order in these notes. They were not for teaching. They were for remembering. Because what he'd learned in his old monastery was not how to explain. It was how to witness. Spring advanced more slowly in the new abbey. The frost clung longer in the hollows, and the apple trees bore fewer blossoms. But the soil held, and where there had been stillness without hope, there was now stillness with shape. The monks took longer at meals. They paused before speaking. They offered silence without suspicion. And at the edge of nearly every scene, by the bread oven, the washing basin, the edge of the chapel wall, stood the goose. Never in the way. Never idle. Just present, like a word you don't need to say because you already know what it means. One day, a cart arrived from the northern roads. Inside, 2 barrels of dried lentils, a bundle of flax, and a letter. It was from Brother Matthias. Anselm read it in the garden while Sentinel preened nearby. "The geese return each spring now," the letter said. "Not all, but enough. Peter believes they carry news. Edmund watches the sky differently, and Elias, bless him, has begun drawing wings in the margins of his psalms. Come home when you can. Or don't. You are where you're needed." Anselm closed the letter and looked up. Sentinel was staring at him. Then, slowly, the goose stepped forward and, just for a moment, placed its head against his knee. Not long, just enough. That summer, the new abbey experienced its first full yield in years. The herbs came strong. The bread rose with fewer cracks. The waterline held. No walls collapsed. No fever spread. The brothers gained weight, not much but enough to walk without leaning. Anselm continued to serve, but less in labor, more in presence. He taught the rhythm of waking early, the slow lighting of candles, the long, silent walks between cloisters and chapel, not because they needed a rule, but because they needed a rhythm that allowed quiet to mean peace, not fear. One evening, Brother Felix, the oldest monk in the abbey, fell asleep in the chapel during Vespers. He slumped gently to the side, head falling forward, arms folded, and beside him, Sentinel climbed onto the bench and rested its body against his. No one moved to wake either of them. The prayers continued, softer than before, as if spoken into a room already full of grace. That autumn, Sentinel began to slow. The walk grew heavier. The wings remained tucked more often. The eyes still shone, but the steps were deliberate in a new way. Anselm noticed first. He said nothing. He simply knelt beside the goose in the mornings, and offered warmth with his hands before rising to meet the day. The other monks began doing the same. A brush of the feathers, a gentle murmur. One left a clover bloom by the chapel step. No one claimed it, but everyone knew. When the first frost arrived, Sentinel did not rise. Anselm found him curled beside the bread oven, eyes closed, body still. There was no sign of pain, only peace. He knelt. He placed his hand on the goose's side, and then, quietly, with the kind of prayer that does not require words, he wept. Not in grief alone, but in honor. Because Sentinel had given something no sermon ever had. A model for presence, a shape for care, a memory of what stillness could mean. They buried the goose beneath the rosemary. No stone, no sign, only feathers. Anselm planted time. Not for symbolism, for scent, for warmth, for the memory of small feet brushing against soft earth. Winter returned. It always does. But it did not arrive alone. For just after the solstice, just after the first heavy snow, a sound echoed through the morning light. Wings. Not loud, but many. The monks gathered in the cloister, and above them, circling. Once before descending onto the frostbitten courtyard, came 6 geese, all silent, all still. Then one stepped forward, brown patch on its beak. Anselm gasped. It was not Sentinel, but it was the same mark, the same shape, the same eyes. The goose walked to him, stopped, and looked up, and in that moment everything returned. Not as memory, as presence, as warmth, as continuation. They say the geese never truly left after that each year, as the wind changed and the trees stiffened, wings would appear above the hills. That one goose, always one, would find its way to Anselm's chapel, curl beneath the altar bench, and remain until spring. The monks stopped asking why. They simply left space. And when they prayed, they sometimes began with silence. Not for solemnity, but because they had learned that the holiest things arrive without needing to be announced, that stillness can hold memory, that a goose, curled beside your feet in the dark, might be the purest sign of love. And so, in monasteries where candles flicker and the wind slips under the doors, where stone remembers every footfall, and warmth comes less from fire and more from nearness, there are still feathers in corners, still prints in frost, still monks who rise before dawn and walk in silence, one behind another, leaving just enough space for something gentle to follow. Because once, long ago, in a winter that almost swallowed them, a goose lay beside a man in silence, and neither one forgot.